Well, welcome to Journey. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here. Great to have you with us today. There's a whole lot going on. Susie gave you an update, I think, on a bunch of those things. I want to recap a few of them. One was Tuesday night Theoria. We've been in this series called The Sound of Glory, and it's basically how do we hear from God? And if you're interested in what does it mean to sit in silence, what it means to be in contemplation or meditation, and perhaps some of those practices are new to you, Tuesday night is a great way to be in an immersive experience, to have someone else, because Doyle and myself, Doyle Yarborough, the two of us tend to kind of tag team this, but one of us facilitates the time. We just kind of help guide you through it, but there's just a lot of quiet and a lot of space for you to just be reflective on who God is and build that spiritual practice. So I just really want to encourage you for that. Excited about what we're doing with kids. If you go, man, I haven't really connected a Journey yet, this is a great way to connect. Or you go, I've been looking for a way to connect with my neighbors or serve my neighbors or somehow do something in the neighborhood. This is a great avenue. We're kind of giving you a path to do it with what we're doing with the Summer's Kids Experience. And then, of course, my part in the story. We've been collecting the cards all along. Today's kind of our big collection Sunday, and as Susie mentioned, we have to reveal that to the bank. So we've told the bank we'll give them the number after next Sunday. That's the week we're going to kind of announce everything. So first of all, we can celebrate this. We have $420,000 already pledged or given to the building. That's pretty amazing. So we're about halfway to we have to be. We need to have about $1 million to do it. We've been praying, God, we'd love to have $2 million, pay for the whole thing. But what we'll do is, starting tomorrow on social media, we'll give you an update on kind of where we are. And so each day we'll give you an update as the cards come in and where our numbers are. And then next Sunday we'll have kind of that final figure, and we'll celebrate together how God is providing for us to enter into this new season for Journey. There's a lot of reasons for us to stretch, sacrifice, go ahead and build a building that will be for our children, to educate them, but also to expand this space. And one of those, of the many reasons, is just the simple fact that there are those who need a place like Journey where they can come and heal and they can experience an awakening. And we've been capturing some of the stories of people through the years at Journey. Well, this story that we have today is with Patrick and MJ, who have only been at Journey for just a few months. They came during the Awakening series. And I wish we had time to kind of show you the expanded version of this video because their story is really powerful. But here's at least a few snippets from the story of Patrick and MJ.
So walking in, it was definitely, just looking around, I'm like, I think this feels like it could be our people, like our tribe, just kind of the sense that I got. But when you started preaching, in that moment, I had never before really experienced the love of God in that way. And God was saying two things to me, and it just destroyed me. He said, I know you, and I love you. It took me a few weeks to really get a kind of understand and be able to articulate what was happening. But I told MJ, I was like, I think my world just got wrecked, like in the best way possible.
When I probed him a little bit after that first Sunday, I was like, so talk to me, like what? And he was like, I just never knew this was out there. Like I didn't know this was a thing.
So how has this awakening impacted our parenting? Before, I think I was pretty determined that I had to have it sorted and had to present this very clear picture of what rightness looks like. But it was all based on fear, and it wasn't motivated by love. And so now, just 2 weeks ago, we were sitting there after dinner, and my two oldest, who were teenagers, cleared the table, and I poured a glass of wine, and they perched on top of the table cross-legged, and we sat there for an hour talking about this journey, this awakening, and about the love of Christ and being aligned with Him and how it allows us to flourish. And leaving that table, I was really aware that I was the richest man in the world. And so I don't have it figured out. We don't have it figured out as parents. Our kids are going to screw up, but it's okay. It's okay. And I think that takes the pressure off, and we just journey through it.
Yeah, they have talked a lot about dad and the differences in dad. Like we drive them to school every morning, or I drive them to school every morning, and it's been really sweet to see because they feel that it's okay to ask questions and mess up, and I think that's probably the biggest difference for them. So.
Patrick and MJ both grew up in an Amish community in the north, and which, if you listen to MJ, she said, at a very young age, I knew I would be exiting this community as quickly as possible. She said there's just too much creativity in me. Like I had to create, and it was too structured. And just this beautiful story of how they have grown and been on this journey. And coming here, he talked about his first Sunday here. He just sobbed to the point that his kids were like, "What is wrong with Dad?" And that's what she was referencing, because the kids have said, "We have a different father." And this is just a few months. And MJ's story is pretty powerful because she said, my dad had an awakening with God. She said when she was a teenager, and she said, I went from having this experience with this man to having a completely different father. And she got a little emotional sharing the story. She said, now I'm experiencing the same thing again with my husband. And these are the kinds of stories that the willingness to just enter the question and be in the mystery and recognize that sometimes somewhere along the way in the church, we could have a long discussion about this, but we got into this thing where there was one right way, that this is the only way to be right. And then, of course, everybody argues about it, and they create the different denominations and then sects within those denominations, and they create these different things that just go, well, this is the only right way. And yet Jesus spoke with parables and stories, and he left this ambiguity to go, no, there's different ways to find me. And to recognize, yes, Jesus is the only way, but there are all these things around that when it comes to discovering who God is. And that he interacts with each of us uniquely, because we're each unique people. And we started this conversation a few months back with the Awakening series, and we've extended that into what we now call the Sound of Glory, to say, okay, as we're awakening to who we are in Christ, what does it mean to really then act and move forward? What spiritual practices and disciplines do we place into our lives so that we can continue on this journey of recognition? Because the deep longing in all of us is to be connected with God, and yet what's our reality most of the time? That we're not. We get lost in some kind of illusion. And so before we go to our story today, I want to read you a quote. It's longer than I would typically read, but it's so good and it's so well written, I wanted to give it to you fully in context. And it sets us up pretty good for this conversation today about prayer in particular. We're going to talk about petition today. But prayer comes from somewhere. It comes from a deep place within us. We feel connected or some connection to God. Here's our setup from Martin Laird from a book called Into the Silent Land. He says this: because God is the ground of our being, the relationship between creature and creator is such that by sheer grace, separation is not possible. Now pause right there for just 1 second, because probably if we grew up in the church, we heard this phrase, sin separates us from God. The statement has a truth to it from a certain perspective. Tim and I were just talking about this, Tim who leads worship in between, that a lot of us grew up hearing this phrase, but what it creates in our mind is sin separates us from God. So like a parent, I'm now displaced from my parent. I'm no longer in relationship or proximity. I'm separated, cut off. The problem with that is, what we don't say is the illusion of sin is that we're separated from God. See, the great illusion is that I'm no longer connected, that I now, sin is a veil, it's a shroud, and it's a lie that says you're not loved, you're disconnected. That's what sin does. So that's the separateness that we naturally feel, because sin is a warning sign. It's this light on the dash that goes ding, 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 ding. Wait a second. You're losing your sense of reality. Reality is that you are deeply and passionately loved, and that you're an expression of the divine. And when you think otherwise, you're actually moving into the illusion. That's where the Matrix films really had it right. You're going back to the Matrix and forgetting reality. Reality is you exist in love. Grace is poured out upon you. Whether or not you want to receive it, accept it, and enter it, it's there for the taking. Let's go on. So he says, God does not know how to be absent. That's not his nature. The fact that most of us experience throughout most of our lives a sense of absence or distance from God is the great illusion that we're caught up in. It's the human condition. This illusion of separation is generated by the mind and is sustained by the riveting of our attention to the interior soap opera, the constant chatter of the cocktail party going on in our heads. I mean, that's now you see why I had to quote the whole thing. Because it's so good, isn't it? I was just talking with a lady today who's in recovery, and she was in her AA group last night, and she said, she was just talking about how they were talking about the hamster wheel, and that everything is moving so fast, so fast, so fast. And she said, I've been in recovery for years, but I'm just now awakening to the deep truth that I need God. And it was actually someone in her recovery group that said, hey, you need to go find a church where you can explore. And she said, but I've just been an atheist. And they said, you're going to have to find something. She's been with us a few months. And she said, I'm slowly awakening to this truth that I'm deeply loved. But it's hard to see it when the cocktail party's going on in our heads. For most of us, this is what normal is, and we are good at coming up with ways of coping with this perceived separation. When we feel the pain, we medicate. With my friend, she medicates with alcohol, but we just pick which way you medicate. We're all addicts of some sort. You just medicate different ways. And so when we deal with the perceived separation, we begin coping. But some of us are not so good at coping, and so we drink ourselves into oblivion, or we cut or we burn ourselves so that the pain will be in a different place and move to the outside. This is why we do things sometimes that are harmful, because we're just trying to remove the pain that's internal. See, the question that hums in the background of our days is whether or not we want to accept the invitation to the banquet of love. Jesus gave all these stories and parables about the kingdom. He just keeps saying, hey, I'm inviting you to a banquet. Like, I want to lavish my love and grace upon you. But you want to keep settling for crumbs. But it's the thing that hums in the background. The invitation never goes away. Jesus keeps knocking at the door saying, if you want to come to the door, you'll find me. I'm here. Sometimes the knocking is annoying and it becomes a longing, and we don't know what to do with the longing, and so we go other places and we visit other gods. But Jesus keeps saying, I'm here. I want you. I'm allowing the circumstances, even the loneliness and the pain of your lives to play out so that you remember you were created for more. The question is whether or not we'll open the door. The question is whether or not we'll respond to the invitation, whether or not we wish to be still long enough to be known. Love involves two things, and it's displayed pretty beautifully in the story we're going to read: a vulnerability and an intentionality. It's vulnerable to ask for what you need. Today we're talking about what it means to lay your petition before God, which a petition is basically, God, I need help. Please, it's an ask. I need this, or I want this. And it's vulnerable because you're saying, I don't have the wherewithal. And that's hard for a lot of us. Definitely hard for me. If you have an individual type personality and want to do it all, it's hard to ask for what you need. There's a vulnerability to it. But there's also an intentionality. There's a discipline. There's a practice, also exemplified in the story we're about to read today. What we find in this person that we're about to read about is he has this ongoing, intimate connection with God. There's a tranquility and vitality about him that just kind of bleeds through the story. You kind of can't miss it because it's in contrast to other people freaking out. Other people, two of the dominant things here are greed and envy that come out, and jealousy, and some of this that happens in the story. But you just see with him, there's this tranquility that seems to surpass all the circumstances. Let me give you another quote. This is by a theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, which, what a name. Sorry, son, I wish I would have been that creative to come up with that for you. This is my son, Hans Urs von Balthasar. George. You could do that for one of your kids. That's just cool. Okay, sorry, anyway. So here's what Balthazar says. Intimacy with the Holy Spirit of truth cancels out the spectator's uninvolved objectivity. I'm going to pause right there for a second because I want you to hear this. The moments when we are not intimate with God tend to be the moments we're most tempted to be cynical, skeptical, full of frustration. Why? Because we have this uninvolved objectivity, meaning we go, what's the deal with God? How could he do this? What about that? And what typically happens, what follows is we with our reason and logic, because we're post-enlightenment, we exist in a culture that has so highly valued in the post-enlightenment way, which is basically reason and logic, as opposed to instinct and other things that were part of cultures for years. We go, God, in my uninvolved objectivity, I don't understand why this happened, and this happened throughout history, or it's happening in my life or other places. So once you can resolve that, then maybe I'll let myself get close to you. That's how a lot of us approach God. We're products of our own culture, of our own programming. But he's saying, intimacy, if you actually enter into the intimacy with truth, it cancels the spectator's uninvolved objectivity with its external critical attitude to the truth and replaces it with an attitude which one can only describe as prayer. So the next time you kind of consider your life and you go, I've been really cynical or really critical, or actually that will probably not occur to you. The next time someone says to you, they give you some feedback and they go, you seem really critical or cynical lately or whatever. If you can receive that feedback, a question to ask yourself is, well, how much time am I spending in prayer? How deeply rooted and connected am I with God? Because from that place, you see the world through a different lens. And we see that in the story we're going to read. I don't know about you, but when it comes to prayer, I have a lot of excuses for why I don't pray. And most of them relate to the demands on my life. Oh, I've got this and I got that, and I have a tendency to respond to other people's demands. I'm learning how to actually pay attention to my own needs. That's a journey for me. But I'm reacting to all the needs that exist, and they never quite go away. So I don't know about you, but so I struggle sometimes with this is my excuse. But then I do sometimes do the comparison game, and then I go, well, man, what about people who run like a global company? Or what about people who are in some political place where they're running a country? I mean, how do those people find time for themselves? Where do those people find time to pray? Well, this is a story about a guy who is the equivalent of the president's chief of staff. So here's a person who's essentially running an entire empire in the 6th century. It's the Persian Empire, and somehow he's a wonderful example to all of us because he finds time to pray. Now, this is a story you're probably familiar with. If you grew up in the church, you've probably heard this story before, so I'm going to read it to us from the Message just to give us a slightly different flavor. Daniel chapter 6. Persian Empire, king at the time was a guy named King Darius. Darius reorganized his kingdom and he appointed 120 governors to administer all the parts of his realm. Over them were 3 vice-regents, one of whom was Daniel. The governors reported to the vice-regents, who made sure that everything was in order for the king. So we get a little kind of organizational structure. But Daniel, brimming with spirit and intelligence, so completely outclassed the other vice-regents and governors that the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom. Let's pause right there. If you're familiar with stories, you can probably tell already this is a great setup. Here's the tension in the story for the inciting incident which is going to follow, that one guy shines above the others and he's given a promotion. Now, we all know stories, we probably lived some of them out, that sometimes when one person gets a promotion, other people do not respond with great glee. Sometimes they're not just happy for the other person, they're unhappy for themselves. We'll get to that in just a second. Before we do, let's highlight a few things about this guy named Daniel. What we discover with him pretty quickly is he had exceptional qualities. There was this excellent spirit within him, according to King James Version. Essentially, he had a disposition that reflected the goodness of God. Where did that come from? What we're going to discover in this story is that Daniel has a foundational relationality. The foundational relationality is that he spends this ongoing time, the king will say this later about Daniel, continually serving and remaining connected to his God. And so here he is, he was a slave, he was captured, he was a captive as a boy, and he was then placed in captivity, but they quickly went, well, there's some of these Hebrew boys have some skills. Let's use them to advance the goals of the kingdom. Now, this was, by the way, this was a thing. When an empire would come and conquer land, they'd pull out some of the best and the brightest, and then they'd spread them out around the empire to use them for their benefit, and also keep them from being concentrated in one place, because if all of the really best and brightest and smart might all hang out together, they could start a revolution. So that was a thing. When you conquered another empire, this was a thing you did. And kind of absorbed them into your culture. Well, Daniel was one of these people who was highlighted. There were a couple other young men with Daniel, by the way. Perhaps you've heard of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had a fiery experience early on. And that happens earlier on in the book. They have a moment. So it's not new for Daniel to stand for things that are right. Daniel is seen as a person who's very dedicated to his faith. Now, this is really interesting because I want you to think of it like this. Daniel is essentially running a pagan government. So what his day-to-day job is to move forward to help a pagan society be successful in its goals, and it's completely incongruent with what he believes in about God. So you have this interesting thing happening. His general job is to be the overseer of a pagan and culture, which is known for its twisted sexuality. It's known for its cruelty. It's known for its violence. I mean, the way they killed people, the Persians left and right, I mean, just bloodthirsty. He's responsible for making the country work. It's in contrast to the very values that he holds dear. And yet somehow he's living in this tension of being in an industry or an empire in which he disagrees. Now, by the way, let's make a quick application. Some of you may be in an industry, a company, a culture, an empire in which you disagree with its leadership. And yet here you are. You find yourself in that country or in that position. Daniel's an example of someone who goes, there are certain places where I have to stand for truth and I cannot acquiesce. And then there are other ways that I might disagree with the overall vision of this thing, but I'm going to remain in it because God's placed me here. This is important for those of us who are living in a point of tension where you go, I don't like this job. I don't like being in this thing. Why does it seem God has me here? Often God keeps us in a place like that because he's churning something in us. He is testing us. He's refining us while he is using us sometimes to affect that culture. There was a book written years and years ago by Bob Briner called Roaring Lambs. He said we need people who will actually enter into the dark places of culture to try and create change there, bring light to it. But when you do that, you're in darkness and there's a lot of dirt. And you get dirty, your hands get dirty in the middle of it. Daniel's this example of somehow someone who lives in the tension of this whole thing. And it's important to identify, too, where does Daniel get his strength? You go, well, at least he had access to a couple of great podcasts. And no, there was no Netflix shows that were there to inspire him. He didn't have a multitude of churches on Franklin Road he could choose from. These were not his options on how to grow. He didn't have this great mentor, not that is identified. So where does he find this spiritual sustenance? In prayer. His disposition is shaped through prayer. Let's keep reading. I have to find where I am. So, remember the point of tension? He's given this promotion. The vice regents and governors got together to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life that they could use against him, but they couldn't dig anything up. He was totally exemplary and trustworthy. They could find no evidence of negligence or misconduct, so they finally give up and said, we're never going to find anything against this Daniel unless we can cook something up religious. Well, since we can't find anything about his character, let's take advantage of his sense of propriety. The vice regents and governors conspired together and then went to the king and said, King Darius, live forever. We've convened our vice regents, governors, and all your leading officials. Not true. Daniel was not consulted. And have agreed that the king should issue the following decree. For the next 30 days, no one is to pray to any god or mortal except you, O king. And anyone who disobeys should be thrown into the lion's den. Issue this decree, O king, and make it unconditional, as if written in stone like all the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And King Darius said, everybody worship me for 30 days? Cool. Yeah, I'll sign it. Let's do it. Which, now keep in mind, it's not like King Darius doesn't know Daniel serves his God, but so in some moment, this flattery, it caught him off guard. Like, he was like, yeah. I mean, some of you might be like, I wish they would do that in my whole household. Like, hey, for the next 30 days, Mom, we're just going to worship you. That'd be great. But for the king, for whatever reasons, the flattery gets to him, and he's like, great idea, let's issue the decree. He doesn't think it through. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted, by the way, this is my favorite part of this entire story. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted, I'll tell you what he didn't do. He didn't go gather with all his people and say, hey, I need you to speak on my behalf because things are about to get rough here and I need you to defend me. He didn't print out his Twitter feed and go, look how much I've been supportive. He didn't go gather documents, look for some great scrolls. He did not defend himself. When Daniel heard the decree, knowing what's going to happen, and he knew what that meant. If it's carved in stone, written in the laws of the Medes and Persians, it meant it can't be changed. David simply, here it is, he continued to pray just as he had always done. I want that to be said about me. Jamie, what did you do when everything went south? What did you do when people criticized you? What did you do when the circumstances came in? I prayed just like I always do. Don't you want that to be said about you? Not said for some false reputation's sake, but said because it just is reflective of, man, yeah, I want that to be a central rhythm of who I am. Because what you see is from this wellspring, you have a man who lives with great vitality. His house had windows in the upstairs that opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day, he knelt there in prayer, thanking and praising his God. The conspirators came and found him praying, asking God for help. So we find 3 things here about David and his prayer life. First of all, he prayed 3 times a day. He opened his windows toward Jerusalem. And then the 3 ways he prayed that are outlined here is thanksgiving, he was thankful, he would praise God, and on this day in particular, he's asking God for help. The idea of him throwing open the windows toward Jerusalem, by the way, I don't know this for sure, but it seems to make sense in the context of the story. If David's living in a culture that's disorienting and disruptive of his spirit, in which he disagrees with the goals of the empire, I wonder if opening the windows isn't just a reminder that goes, this is my home. It's a reminder, Jerusalem was a metaphor very much for the Jewish people. This is where the dwelling place of God is. God is my rock. He is the one I serve. He is where I place my trust. And there's also kind of an aspect of David's even setting his environment. He's getting out of the palace. He's getting out of the offices. He goes to a place where he knows he can be before the Lord. And 3 times a day, a very busy man is sure to place his trust in God. And he praises, he thanks, and he asks for help. They went straight to the king and reminded him of the royal decree that he had signed. Did you not, they said, sign a decree forbidding anyone to pray to any god or man except you for the next 30 days? And anyone caught doing so would be thrown into the lion's den? Absolutely, said the king, written in stone like all the laws of Medes and Persians. Then they said, Daniel, your favorite, one of the Jewish exiles, ignores you, O king, and defies your decree. 3 times a day he prays. I mean, this was they were like, we got you. And we got Daniel. And Darius' response is, oh, crud. At this, the king was very upset and tried his best to get Daniel out of the fix he'd put him in. He worked it the whole day long. He's trying to figure out, how do I get around this rule? Oh, my gosh, they got me. They played me. Imagine, by the way, how angry he probably is with these conspirators, but he's stuck. I mean, they got him. They played him. It's written in stone. It can't be changed. He's got to follow the laws of the land. But then the conspirators were back. Remember, O king, it's the law of the Medes and Persians. The king's decree cannot be changed. So they're pressing him. So the king caved in and ordered Daniel brought and thrown into the lion's den. But he said to Daniel, and it gets some imagery here. The den there's a slab that is over the den, so you lower someone down into the den. And imagine they're lowering Daniel, and he's 85, by the way, probably at this time. So he needs a little help being lowered in. So they're lowering Daniel down into the lion's den. Now, by the way, keep in mind, if you're Daniel, you've been praying 3 times a day for a long time, and Daniel's asking God for help. God, I'd rather not die. Would you please help me? And here he is being lowered into the lions. If it were me, I'd be like, God, this is happening. Should I have prayed 4 times today? But God's allowing the circumstance to play out. And a lot of times when we're praying, we're like, God, here comes that bill. Here comes that broken relationship. Here comes the divorce papers. Here comes that health issue. God, make it go away. And he goes, no, I'm actually going to take you through it. Daniel's being lowered in, and as he's being lowered in, the king rushes up, and he looks at Daniel, and he doesn't talk about his faith in himself, and he doesn't talk about any kind of faith in his own gods or anything like that. He looks at Daniel, just speaks so much to the character of Daniel. He looks at Daniel, and he says, but he says to Daniel, this is in verse 16, your God to whom you are so loyal, he's going to get you out of this. There's this little bit of faith in Daniel's God that's been transferred to the king of an empire. A stone slab was placed over the opening of the den. The king sealed the cover with his signet ring and the signet rings of all the nobles, fixing Daniel's fate. It means this can't be undone. The king went back to his palace. He refused supper. He couldn't sleep. He spent the night fasting. At daybreak, the king is sprinting up. He gets up, hurries to the lion's den, and as he approaches the den, he calls out anxiously, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve so loyally, saved you from the lions? O king, live forever. Which the king was like, yes, he's still alive. He's down in the den. My God sent his angels, who closed the mouths of the lions so they would not hurt me. I've been found innocent before God and also before you, O king. By the way, I haven't done anything to harm you. When the king heard these words, he was happy, and he ordered Daniel be taken up out of the den. And when he was hauled up, there wasn't a scratch on him. He had trusted his God. And then the king commanded that the conspirators who had informed on Daniel be thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Before they hit the floor, the lions had them in their jaws, tearing them to pieces. And clearly, King Darius was still King Darius. And so, by the way, we have in this contrast, too, the way the pagans existed. There was no sense of mercy. There was no sense of forgiveness. There's no sense of grace. It's just a swift sense of justice, absent any mercy. And King Darius published his proclamation every color, creed, and on earth. So Darius is still working from his framework of what justice is, but he can't get around the fact that Daniel's God is powerful. And so this pagan king essentially writes a worship song. Peace to you, abundant peace. I decree that Daniel's God shall be worshipped and feared in all parts of my kingdom. He is the living God, world without end. His kingdom never fails. His rule continues eternally. He is a savior and a rescuer. He performs astonishing miracles in heaven and on earth. He saved Daniel from the power of the lions. It's not unusual that when God's power is on display, even those who are unaware speak out the glory of God. And then we get our epilogue in verse 28. From then on, Daniel was treated well during the reign of Darius and also in the following reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we have on display a man who was willing to stand for truth, but it came simply out of the rhythms of his life. Yes, it was his work ethic. Yes, it was his relationship with God because he was identified as one who was continually serving and loyal. Yes, there was courage. Yes, there was discipline. But beyond all that, there's just this sense that Daniel communed with God. Balthazar, I was reading a book on prayer, and he makes this observation about Mary. Remember Mary and Martha, the two sisters? He makes an observation of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. But as I read it, I just was so struck that I thought, I'll bet this was a lot like Daniel. This is what he says about Mary, but think of it in the context of Daniel, or the context of someone who sits and communes with God. He says this, the attention given to Jesus was by no means a personal indulgence or a pleasant daydreaming. Nor was it selective groping for those ideas which suited her, which she felt able to translate into reality, let alone pass on to others as her ideas. He's making the point that sometimes when we go to prayer, we're going to prayer to prove something to ourselves or to God or to others. Rather, again, he's talking about Mary, but make the application to Daniel. It was an entirely open-ended readiness for the word, a readiness to participate in it, without preferences, without picking and choosing, without a priori restrictions. It was an alert, sober attitude, attentive to the slightest indications, yet ready to embrace the widest panoramas. It's this spirit of prayer that says, I'm so open that the slightest nudge of your spirit, yes, here I go, in faith, in obedience. And yet, I'm also open to some incredibly new, mysterious way of seeing the world that I've never thought before. That this is the posture that we're called into when it comes to prayer. And it seems that Daniel exemplifies this. He is unmoved. He just simply continues to be Daniel. Just is Daniel. Daniel does what Daniel does, believing that God's going to do what God does. Richard Rohr tells a story. He's a priest, and he tells a story of his young priest. He had a spiritual director, and the spiritual director finally pulled him aside, and he was Franciscan, which meant that they consider Francis of Assisi and the priesthood as like a spiritual father. So the spiritual director pulls him aside, and he goes, "Hey, Richard, here's the deal. You're not Saint Francis, okay? You're not Francis of Assisi. You need to accept that. Truthfully, you're not even close. So just probably time to just go and accept that reality." And Richard said, this young priest, he wants to do the right thing. He's like, "Yeah, but I want to be like my father, Francis." He's like, "You're Richard from Kansas. Be Richard from Kansas." And he wrote his journal, "That's not nearly as dramatic or exciting. I want to be Francis of Assisi." And ultimately, this relinquishment to go, would you just be who God's called you to be in God's presence continually? So insert your name. Just be you in continual relationship with God. And God will use you in your circumstance, as in your role, in your world, whether it be tiny or whether it be big, to impact the world in your way. And by the way, impacting the world might be impacting one person. It might be two people. In our limited view, just be who you're called to be. Unfortunately, sometimes we get lost in who we weren't. We're lost in our regret, our shame, even guilt for the future, for the past. And we have to trust when the critic's voices come, which might be a self-critic inside your head, or it might be other people. Will you trust that God will expose your false motives? Maybe there's some truth to what a critic has to say. Will you trust that God will expose those false motives as you journey if you'll remain open to Him? You might not know. The truth is, some critic in your life might be right. Sometimes I sat with one counselor and he was like, "Hey, you know these 3 things we're talking about? This is really jacked up in you." I'm like, "Oh, thanks." He goes, "Yeah, but that's not all. There's probably about 40 more. We just don't have time to get to them." I'm like, "What?" Well, you just lack awareness. You don't totally understand what's going on in an internal place. That's what the spiritual journey is all about. But if you'll remain in a posture of humility, then God will expose the false motives. And then as far as the true motives, there's actually somebody really connected to who you are in Christ, but somebody doesn't see it, or they're making fun of that. Something good in your life, they're criticizing you for that. Do we trust that while other people may not see us, and by the way, the other person may not see you is your spouse, your child, a boss, can you trust that God sees you? And the way that God sees you and the way you hear from God is by spending time with Him, by bringing your petitions vulnerably and entering into a spiritual practice, a discipline, intentionally, choosing to pray, whether it's 3 times a day, 1 time a day, 5 times a day, but being intentional with placing yourself before God. And when we do that, we're reminded we walk because of God's grace. It's who we are now, today. See, when you're with God, it dispels the lies about whatever yesterday was. Today's today, and His grace pours out upon you. You're absolutely enough, who you are today, right here, at this moment, for God's grace to pour out over you and through you and display His light to the world. When you walk in your life in the rhythms of God, you can walk with confidence. Daniel is such a wonderful illustration for that because Daniel is the example of a spiritual athlete. He's successful because of his vulnerability and his intentionality. It becomes his understanding of discipline. And God, in his greatness, is often displaying his power through us. He did this through Daniel. And in many ways, Daniel's a wonderful book on literature, but this is a bit of a foreshadowing for Jesus as well. Through Daniel's experience, God gives hints of what would occur when Christ came to deal with the powers of darkness. That Jesus entered the den of the lions. But what happens in God's world, in the kingdom, death is ultimately crushed. Whatever we think is Daniel's going down into the den, but he's rescued and he's saved. Jesus goes down into the pit. Ultimately, he comes back from hell as the victor. He conquers sin and death, and justice arrives swiftly for those who are slaves to their own jealousy. So let me leave you with a few questions. Who are we serving continually? Whose expectations rule your life? Are you really serving someone else out of fear? Sometimes, by the way, our marriages are built around fear. Sometimes our parenting is built around fear. Sometimes our friendships are built around fear, some form of codependency. Well, I got to make sure I do this or my friend's not going to be my friend anymore. I don't want to disrupt our friendship. Who are you serving? Or do you go, no, I'm serving God. This is the primary voice that's in my life. What kind of spiritual athleticism exists in your life? Are there some spiritual practices that you go, yes, I'm bringing myself to this. There's a discipline. Not to earn God's love, but because of grace, I'm applying myself to this discipline. And then finally, what keeps us from asking for what we need? Especially, I think, guys, this is even harder for us. There's something, kind of, maybe it's in culture or whatever, that we're meant to be the strong person, the individual, the rugged individual. We have what we need. We'll be the rescuer. We'll be whatever. It's often really hard. It certainly is for me to ask for what I need. It's very vulnerable. And yet, if we don't ask, we don't receive. Daniel's an example of going in the rhythm of his communion with God, this praising, this thanksgiving, but then when he's in time of need, he just asks. And then he trusts. There's tranquility. Some of us ask and then we stress out for the next 3 weeks. And when the stress comes and the anxiety comes, just stop praying to yourself and go back and ask again. And ask again. And ask again. There's a humility that comes with asking. There's a reason that Daniel went to his knees. Our opening song is about getting on our knees. Oftentimes you hear stories about people dropping to their knees. There's a humility to getting on our knees and saying, God, I need help. And if we listen, he'll respond. Would you pray with me? Before we go to music, and really a time of thanksgiving and praise, let's have a moment of prayer. So just eyes closed or head down or some place of focus. What is it that you need right now? What is your greatest need, or perhaps your greatest desire? Maybe it's just a want. You just really want, there's a longing. What is it? Would you, right now, take that to the Lord in prayer? Speak it out. Ask him. Father, the need that's pressing on my heart today is the need for our church community, for our children, for us to have space to educate them, to ground them in the Word while their memories are still so vibrant, their ability to memorize and hold things, God. So, God, for us to have expanded space that where we can serve our children, and not just on Sundays, but throughout the week. And so, God, this need to love our children well, and secondly, need to create more space for people and a way for people to get onto campus, just to apply what we knew we needed from the moment we moved to this property. God, to just create more space. I feel that need, and so that need is connected to finances, and so we have a financial need. And so, God, I ask that you would meet that need in whatever way you see fit. Use us as a community. For some of us, there would be sacrifice, or maybe a deeper level of commitment. I feel that pressing for our church community. God, for each person here, whatever their need, their want, their desire, would you meet them at that point of need? Would they experience you in the interaction? And the yes, the no, the wait, whatever the answer is, that they would sense that you're close. For all of us, would we press into that relationality with you? That our time of prayer with you would be robust. We would find vitality in communing with you. And God, I intercede for one of our families this morning, for Terry and Susie Dunham, for their son Chris, for their daughter. God, it appears that these are Chris's final moments on the earth. God, it's so painful to bury a child. And for Chris, in these last moments, would your Spirit speak to his heart? We rejoice he found faith here. He loves you, he trusts you, he's awakened to who you are. And I know what's next for him is beyond our comprehension. And we celebrate his transition into a different expression of eternity. But for Terry and Susie in particular, Mom and Dad, would you be with them? Would you be their comfort? Would you be their strength? Would you hold them up in this time of great pain? God, our needs truly are great in a community this size. So we tell you today that we trust you, we trust your Spirit. We're willing to lean in and listen. Give us the strength and obedience to follow. And here in these moments, would you hear our praise, our worship, our thanksgiving? For in the midst of whatever is broken, there is so much that is good. We're grateful. In Jesus' name, amen.